An old man lies on a low bed in a house in Goshen, Egypt, and the air smells of river mud and roasted grain. He is 110 years old. His sons stand around him, grown men now, some with gray already in their beards. And he lifts one hand and asks them to swear an oath, not to bury him here, in the land where he has ruled for 80 years, not to leave him among the pyramids and the priests he has served his entire adult life. He makes them swear that when God finally leads their children out of this country, they will carry his bones with them, his own bones, out of Egypt, into a land he has not stood in for over 90 years. You would think a man who rose from a well in the desert to the right hand of Pharaoh would want a monument in the most powerful nation on earth. Instead, he asks for a promise that will not be kept for 400 years. Stay with me, because to understand that request, you have to understand what happened in the decades nobody talks about. Not the coat, not the pit, not even the prison. You need to see the years historians call the missing middle of Joseph's story. The part where the boy who was betrayed has to decide what kind of man he is actually going to become. This is not a story about a coat of many colors. This is not a story about 11 jealous brothers. This is not even a story about a famine. This is a story about what a man does with power once he finally gets it, and what he does with the very people who tried to destroy him. Genesis spends 13 chapters getting Joseph out of a pit and into a palace. Then it spends the rest of his life in a handful of paragraphs, as if the ending mattered less than the rise. But it is in those later years, his marriage, his sons, his brother's return, his father's death, his own long fade into old age, that you find out who Joseph actually became. And you find it starting with a name most viewers have never even heard. When Pharaoh promotes Joseph, he does not let him keep his old identity. He gives him an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, records that the name meant something close to revealer of secrets, a fitting title for a man who had just decoded the king's dreams. Josephus also describes Joseph riding through the land in a royal chariot, wearing purple, sealing decrees with Pharaoh's own ring. Pharaoh gives him a wife too, Asenath, daughter of a priest from the Sun Temple at On. And almost overnight, the boy who spent years chained in an Egyptian dungeon becomes the second most powerful man on the entire continent. You can imagine what that kind of reversal would do to a person. Not pride, you would expect pride. Instead, when Asenath gives him his first son, Joseph names the boy Manasseh, which means causing to forget. He tells anyone who asks that God has made him forget his hardship and his father's house. Sit with that for a second. Forget his father's house. This is a man trying to bury a wound so deep he names his own child after the burial. You also have to picture what Joseph actually did with the 7 good years before the famine hit. He did not simply store grain. He traveled the whole of Egypt, city by city, building storehouses so large the text says the writers eventually gave up trying to count the harvest, comparing it to the sand of the sea. This is not a man riding on a lucky interpretation. This is a man who took a dream seriously enough to spend 7 years preparing for a disaster nobody else believed was coming. That discipline, more than the dream itself, is probably what saved Egypt. Picture the scale of what you are actually looking at here. An entire nation trusts its future to a 30-year-old former prisoner because Pharaoh trusted him first. Every granary from the delta to the southern border fills up under Joseph's orders. year after year, while the rest of the region has no idea what is coming. You could call it foresight. The text calls it the hand of God. Either way, when the famine finally hits, it does not stop at Egypt's border. Genesis says the whole earth came to Egypt to buy grain, which means every decision Joseph made inside one palace ends up feeding an entire ancient world he will never fully see. But grief has a way of finding you even when you build a palace on top of it. Here's what most people miss. The very famine that made Joseph famous is the same famine that forces the wound back open. When his brothers walk into the grain markets of Egypt, bowing to a foreign official they do not recognize, Joseph recognizes every single one of them instantly. And for the first time in over 20 years, the boy from the pit is standing 3 feet away from the men who put him there. He does not reveal himself, not yet. He accuses them of being spies. He locks up Simeon, the second oldest, and holds him hostage until they return with proof. He plants silver in their sacks on the way home, and later a silver cup in Benjamin's sack specifically, forcing them into an impossible position. Some readers call this cruelty. It is not cruelty. It is the only kind of test a betrayed man can run on people who have never once apologized to him. He needs to know if they are still the same men. He needs to know if they would sell another favored brother, the young Benjamin, the same way they once sold him. Think about what Benjamin represents in this whole scene. He is Joseph's only full brother, the one child Rachel gave Jacob before she died, giving birth to him. If you were Joseph, testing whether these men had actually changed, Benjamin is the only lever you could pull that would tell you the truth. So he sets the trap. A silver cup hidden in Benjamin's grain sack, discovered just as the brothers leave the city, positioned so that Benjamin alone appears guilty and can be kept behind as a slave. Watch what the other brothers do in that moment. They do not run. They do not abandon him the way they abandoned Joseph 22 years earlier. They tear their clothes and walk back into the city together, all of them, to stand beside the boy who is not even guilty of anything. And this is where it gets remarkable. When Judah, the very brother who once suggested selling Joseph for silver, offers to trade his own freedom for Benjamin's, something inside Joseph breaks. Judah stands in front of the most powerful man in Egypt and says, in essence, "Take me instead. Let the boy go home to our father, because losing him will kill the old man." That is the moment, not the silver cup, not the accusation. The moment Judah chooses to bear the cost himself is the moment Joseph can no longer hold the mask in place. He clears the room of every Egyptian attendant. And then, in a language his brothers have not heard him speak in over 2 decades, he says 4 words that must have landed like thunder in that room. I am Joseph. Genesis says he wept so loudly the household of Pharaoh heard it through the walls. 10 grown men who once threw a boy into a hole in the ground are now standing in front of that same boy, ruler of the nation that could crush every one of them with a single word. And he is the one sobbing. Here comes a pattern reset worth sitting with. He does not ask them to grovel. He does not list their crimes back to them one by one. He asks a single question. Is my father still alive? Not, how could you? Not, why? Just, is my father alive? 22 years of power, and the first thing out of his mouth is about the old man back in Canaan. That tells you exactly where Joseph's heart had lived all along. Not in the palace. In the memory of a father who thought his favorite son was dead. There's one more thing you need to see before we move to the part almost nobody talks about. Joseph tells his brothers not to be angry with themselves. He tells them, God sent him ahead of them to preserve life. This is not denial. He does not pretend the pit never happened. He simply refuses to let the pit be the whole story. Hold that thought, because it becomes the theme running underneath everything that follows in Joseph's later years. Word reaches Jacob that his son is alive, and the old patriarch, who spent over 20 years in mourning, who tore his clothes and refused every attempt at comfort when he believed Joseph was dead, loads up his entire household and travels toward Egypt. Genesis tells you Jacob is 130 years old when he finally stands before Pharaoh. Try to picture that reunion for a moment. A father who buried a son in his heart for 2 decades, watching him step down from an Egyptian chariot, alive, powerful, weeping again. Joseph falls on his father's neck and, the text says, weeps a good while. Pharaoh gives the family the land of Goshen, the richest pasture land in the delta. And Jacob's household, 70 people in total, settles there to live. And in a scene almost nobody remembers, when Jacob is finally brought before Pharaoh himself, the old shepherd does something you would never expect from a foreign refugee meeting the most powerful ruler on earth. He blesses Pharaoh twice. An old nomad from Canaan, standing in front of a king, and it is the king who receives the blessing, even at his most vulnerable. Jacob never forgets who he actually represents. Pharaoh even asks Jacob his age, and you get one of the strangest, most honest lines in the entire book. Jacob says the years of his life have been few and hard, and that he has not even reached the years his own father and grandfather lived. This is a man who just watched his family come back from the dead, standing in the most powerful court on the planet, and he still tells the truth about how hard his life has actually been. There is no performance in it. You get the sense that Jacob, more than almost anyone else in Genesis, never learned how to pretend. But watch what happens next, because this is not the end of the story. This is where the real untold part of Joseph's life actually begins. Genesis gives you 17 more years of Jacob living in Egypt, and almost nobody ever preaches a single sermon on them. For 17 years, you get to watch Jacob live inside Goshen, quietly witnessing his once shattered family knit itself back together around him. And when death finally comes for the old man, he does something extraordinary. He calls for Joseph's 2 Egyptian-born sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and formally adopts them as his own full heirs among the 12 tribes of Israel, equal in standing to their uncles. Then, blind and dying, he crosses his own hands on purpose, placing his right hand, the hand of the greater blessing, on the younger son, Ephraim, instead of the firstborn, Manasseh. Joseph tries to correct him, moving his father's hand back toward Manasseh. The old man refuses. He knows exactly what he is doing. This is a family whose entire history has been shaped by younger sons receiving blessings meant for the elder. Jacob himself took his own brother's blessing decades earlier, and now the old man passes that same pattern down on purpose, with his eyes wide open. If you are still with me, this is your reminder to hit subscribe, because we are about to reach the part of Joseph's story that almost never makes it into a sermon: the death of Jacob. And the moment his brothers finally discover whether Joseph's forgiveness was ever really real. Jacob gathers all 12 sons around his deathbed and speaks a blessing over each one. Really a prophecy, dense with imagery, some of it warning, some of it praise. If you were standing in that room, you would hear an old man settling 22 years of family history in a single afternoon, out loud, in front of everyone. Over Reuben, the firstborn, he speaks of instability, unstable as water, a line tied to an old betrayal inside the family tent. Over Simeon and Levi, he speaks of anger and violence, a memory of a massacre they carried out years earlier that their own father never forgot. Over Judah, the brother who once offered his own life for Benjamin, Jacob speaks of a scepter that will never depart from his line, a promise that will one day point all the way to a king the whole family cannot yet imagine. Over Joseph, he speaks of a fruitful branch beside a well, blessed above his brothers, a man who was shot at by archers and was not defeated. You can hear, in that one blessing, a father finally saying out loud what he believed about his favorite son all along. Then Jacob dies. Genesis says Joseph falls on his father's face, weeps over him, and kisses him. What follows is one of the most historically specific details in the entire Old Testament. Joseph orders his father embalmed in the Egyptian style, a process, the text says, takes 40 days, followed by 70 days of national mourning throughout Egypt. Mourning rites you would only ever see given to a member of the royal household. Then Joseph asks Pharaoh's own permission to leave the country he governs, travels with a massive Egyptian funeral procession all the way back into Canaan, and buries his father in the cave of Machpelah, the same cave where Abraham buried Sarah generations earlier. A grief this large gets a funeral this large. But it gets stranger. The moment Jacob is in the ground, something shifts in the brothers. With their father gone, the one presence that had quietly kept the peace, fear creeps back in through the cracks. They send Joseph a message. Some scholars believe they may have even invented parts of it, claiming Jacob's dying wish was for Joseph to forgive them completely. In Hebrew, their request uses the word nasa, a word that literally means to lift, to carry, to bear something away. It is the same word Scripture uses when a heavy load is physically lifted off an animal's back. They are not asking Joseph to forget what happened to him. They are asking him to carry the weight of it so they never have to. And Joseph weeps again. Grown men, prostrating themselves in front of him, offering to become his slaves for the rest of their lives. And Joseph answers with a line that has outlived every empire in the ancient world. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about this present result, to save many lives. This is not a story about revenge withheld through gritted teeth. This is not a story about grudging tolerance dressed up as virtue. This is not a story about pretending the pit never happened. This is a story about a man who looked directly at the worst thing that was ever done to him and refused to let it have the final word over the rest of his life. Now watch what happens next, because this is the part that almost always gets skipped. Genesis fast forwards through decades in a single breath. Joseph lives to see his own great-grandchildren. Ephraim's grandchildren are placed on his knees, the text tells you, meaning he formally welcomes them into the family line with his own hands. He watches over Egypt for 80 more years from a position of enormous power. And as far as the record shows, he never once asks to go home. He never leaves. He builds his entire life, his entire legacy, inside the very nation that once enslaved him as a teenager. Consider that same pattern playing out in a completely different setting, one you might actually recognize from your own life. Every family that has ever gone through a rupture, a betrayal, an estrangement, years of silence at the dinner table, eventually reaches a moment where the person who was wronged has to decide what kind of life they are going to build on the other side of the hurt. You have probably watched someone do this yourself, whether you realized it at the time or not. A parent forgiving a child who broke their heart years earlier. A sibling finally showing up at a hospital bed after a decade of silence between them. Sitting down in the chair nobody thought they would ever sit in again. If you have lived through anything like that, you already know the forgiveness rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. It usually arrives quietly, almost anticlimactically, long after the anger has already burned itself out. And it almost never erases the years that were lost. It simply decides that the years still ahead are worth more than the years already spent grieving what happened. Then Joseph, at 110 years old, gathers his own brothers one final time. He tells them exactly what he told them decades earlier, that God will surely visit them and bring them out of this country, back to the land promised to their fathers. And then he makes them swear, the oath you heard at the very start of this video. Carry my bones out of this country. Do not bury me here. This is where the open loop finally closes. Joseph has spent 80 years as an Egyptian ruler. He will be embalmed like Egyptian royalty when he dies, given every honor the most powerful nation on earth could possibly offer a foreigner. And yet, his dying request has nothing to do with Egypt at all. It is a bet placed on a promise he will not live to see fulfilled. 4 centuries later, when Moses finally leads the Israelites out of slavery in the Exodus, the book of Exodus tells you, he personally carries Joseph's bones with him out of the country. The oath is kept, 400 years late, by a man who was not even born when the promise was made. That is not the ending of a man chasing power for its own sake. That is the ending of a man who never once stopped believing he belonged somewhere else, no matter how comfortable his palace became. If you have ever built a life somewhere you never planned to stay, carrying a promise you are not sure will ever be kept, you already understand exactly what Joseph was doing on that bed in Goshen. He was not planning his funeral. He was planting a seed 400 years deep, trusting people he would never meet to finish what he could not. So here is what this story actually leaves you with. First, the truth about forgiveness. It is not a feeling you sit around waiting to arrive. It is a decision you make, and then keep making. The way Joseph kept choosing his brothers over and over again across 2 full decades. If you are waiting to feel ready before you forgive someone, you may be waiting for the rest of your life. Second, the truth for you personally. Whatever pit someone once threw you into, you still get to decide whether it becomes the whole story of your life or just one chapter inside a much longer one. Nobody else gets to make that decision for you. And third, the one that should sit with you the longest after this video ends. The promises you make with your dying breath can outlive you by 400 years. If the people you leave behind actually believed you meant them, what you say in your final years may matter more to the people who love you than anything you built while you were strong. Which part of Joseph's later years hit you hardest? The reunion in the grain market, the forgiveness after Jacob's death, or the oath about the bones? Tell me in the comments below. Joseph was not remembered by his own family as the man who ran Egypt's grain economy for 80 years. He was remembered as the man who asked, with his dying breath, to be carried home.